Welcome to Latino Stories. If you love jaw-dropping HOA drama, you're in the right place. From corrupt board members to outrageous neighborhood disputes, we expose the wildest HOA scandals. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's dive into today's crazy HOA tale.
I took a sip of my coffee and nearly choked when I read the letter. It wasn't a bill, wasn't a tax notice. No, it was something far worse. According to the pristine, official-looking document, my 50-acre ranch, the same land my grandfather had broken his back working, the same land I had poured my blood, sweat, and beer money into, was no longer mine. At least, not entirely. The Homeowners Association, a group I had never been part of, had decided, without my knowledge or consent, that my ranch was now designated as community land for the entire neighborhood. I squinted at the words, reread them, and then did the only logical thing. I laughed. Hard. But the laughter died when I got to the part that said, effective immediately, all fences, barriers, or private property signage must be removed in accordance with HOA guidelines. That was when my coffee mug met the floor, shattering into 100 pieces. A creeping, hot rage curled in my chest. These people were actually serious. They were trying to steal my land. An hour later, I stood at the front gate as a tan sedan with a ridiculous HOA logo on the side rolled up my driveway like it owned the place. The door opened, and out stepped Margaret Dawson, a middle-aged woman with a round figure squeezed into a blazer 3 sizes too small. She adjusted her clipboard and strutted up to me with the kind of confidence only people who had never been punched in the face had. Behind her, 2 other HOA board members, equally smug, equally overdressed, hovered like vultures over a fresh carcass. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice syrupy with fake politeness, "we sent you the notice regarding the community land designation. We'd like to discuss the next steps." I folded my arms and stared at her, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Next steps," I finally said. "Yeah, I got a next step. It's called trespassing laws." Margaret let out a small chuckle, the kind that said she found me amusingly stupid. "Oh, I think there's a misunderstanding," she said. "You see, our board voted unanimously to include your land within the HOA jurisdiction. Since your ranch has historically been accessible to community members for hiking and leisure." Historically, I cut her off. "The only thing this land has historically been used for is ranching. And my land isn't part of your HOA. Margaret gave me a patronizing smile. "It is now." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. None came. She actually believed this nonsense. I looked at the 2 board members behind her, both nodding along like well-trained parrots, and felt a sudden urge to throw something. Instead, I exhaled through my nose and forced my voice to stay even. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You people, who don't own a single blade of grass on this land, held a little vote and decided my private property belongs to you?" Margaret tilted her head, as if explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Not to us, Mr. Monroe. To the community." I was still processing the absolute insanity of this when a silver SUV came rolling up my driveway. The doors popped open, and out spilled a family of 4. 2 parents, 2 kids, and a golden retriever. They set off towards my pasture like they were at a public park. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" I shouted, marching toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" The dad, a balding man in a golf shirt, smiled at me like I was the one intruding. "Oh, Margaret said the HOA opened up this land for public use," he said, tossing a frisbee to his son. "Figured we'd check it out." Margaret, who had followed me, placed a firm hand on my shoulder as if we were old friends. "Jack, this is exactly what we were talking about. Community members enjoying their space." I shrugged her hand off and turned back to the family. "This isn't your space. This is my land." The wife looked at me, puzzled. "But the HOA said." "I don't give a damn what the HOA said," I growled. "Get off my property." The husband frowned. "No need to be rude, buddy. I was about to inform him that he was about 3 seconds from getting his golf shoes filled with manure when another car pulled up, followed by another. More people were arriving, picnic baskets in hand, like I had personally invited them for a neighborhood cookout. My ranch was being invaded in real time, and I felt like I was trapped in some bizarre nightmare. I turned back to Margaret, my patience officially gone. "Get these people off my land. Now." Her eyes widened in mock innocence. "Oh, Jack, there's no need for hostility. This transition will be easier if we all work together." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Margaret, I swear on my granddaddy's grave, if you don't get off my property, I will personally escort you down the driveway with a garden hose." That finally got a reaction. Margaret's smugness faltered for half a second before she recovered. "Well," she sniffed, adjusting her blazer, "I suppose we'll have to escalate this matter." She turned on her heel and stormed back to her car, her lackeys scuttling after her. The trespassers, realizing something was off, started shuffling back to their vehicles. As Margaret got into her sedan, she gave me one last look. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer." I grinned, slow and mean. "You'll be hearing from my shotgun." The moment they were gone, I grabbed my phone and dialed Curtis McGraw, my lawyer. Curtis wasn't just a lawyer. He was the kind of guy who made a living off crushing overreaching HOAs. He answered on the first ring. "Curtis," I said, "I've got a situation." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in his office, explaining everything. Curtis listened, nodding along, occasionally scribbling notes. When I finished, he leaned back, chewing on the end of his pen. "Ah, the classic HOA land grab," he said, sighing like a man who had seen too much. "They don't actually have legal grounds, but they're banking on you rolling over." I frowned. "So how do I stop them?" Curtis smirked. "You don't just stop them. You fight dirty." I leaned forward. "I'm listening." Curtis tapped his fingers against the desk. "First thing you do is make it impossible for them to use the land. You need deterrence, fences, signs, security systems, the works." "Already got fences," I muttered. "Not that they care." "Then electrify them," Curtis said with a wicked grin. "And make sure it's perfectly legal." I sat back, considering the idea. It was crazy. It was extreme. And I loved it. I spent the next morning at the county records office, digging through every legal document I could find on the HOA's jurisdiction. As expected, my land was never part of their territory, never signed over, and certainly never up for public use. But that didn't stop Margaret Dawson from trying to rewrite reality. She had filed paperwork claiming an annexation of my property into the HOA, citing some obscure community development clause. It was complete nonsense, but it was nonsense that could cost me everything if I didn't fight back. That same afternoon, I marched into the HOA's office, which was a stuffy little building attached to the community clubhouse. Margaret sat behind a desk, shuffling through paperwork, looking as smug as ever. She barely glanced up when I walked in. "Jack," she said in that syrupy voice that made my skin crawl, "I assume you're here to discuss compliance with the new regulations." I slapped a folder onto her desk. "Actually, I'm here to give you a bill." Margaret arched an eyebrow and opened the folder. Inside were the official documents confirming that my land had never been under HOA jurisdiction, until they decided to annex it. And since they claimed my property was now part of the association, that meant they owed me. Specifically, they owed me 20 years' worth of unpaid HOA dues for the land they had supposedly managed. The number I wrote down was just over $200,000. Margaret's face turned a shade of pale I hadn't thought possible. This is absurd." "No, what's absurd is you thinking you could steal my land," I said. "So here's the deal. Either the HOA pays me everything they owe, or we take this fight to court, where a judge is gonna have a field day with your fraudulent land grab." Margaret's lips tightened. "The board will never agree to this." "Then I suggest you find a way to make them," I said. "Oh, and one more thing. Until this is settled, I'll be making a few modifications to my property. I walked out before she could argue. By the time the sun set, I had ordered enough fencing material to make Alcatraz look like a playground. The next morning, I got to work. The first thing I did was reinforce my fences with industrial-grade wiring. Then I installed a state-of-the-art security system, motion sensors, floodlights, cameras, the whole 9 yards. But the best part? The electric fencing. Nothing lethal, of course, just enough voltage to send a firm message to any would-be trespassers. By noon, word had spread that I wasn't backing down. Curious neighbors gathered at the edges of my property, whispering among themselves. Some looked concerned, others amused. Margaret, however, was furious. She stormed up to my gate, flanked by 2 HOA board members and a clipboard clutched in her fists. "This is a clear violation of HOA regulations," she seethed. "Funny," I said, leaning casually against the fence. "I don't remember agreeing to any HOA regulations." She huffed, flipping through her paperwork. "Electric fences are dangerous. So is trespassing," I said. "But since you and your little club are so determined to claim my land, I figured I'd make it more community-friendly." Margaret's eyes darted to the massive LED sign I had installed near the entrance of my ranch. In bright, flashing letters it read, "Warning, trespassers will be zapped." "You're out of control," she said, voice shaking with frustration. "No, I'm just warming up," I replied. That weekend, the HOA decided to test my patience in the most ridiculous way possible. They organized a massive community picnic on my land. I wasn't even surprised when I saw dozens of people setting up folding chairs, blankets, and grills right in the middle of my pasture. Kids ran around with kites, dogs chased frisbees, and someone even had the nerve to set up a volleyball net. It was as if my land had officially become a public park overnight. I watched from my porch, sipping on a cold beer, waiting for the inevitable. Sure enough, it didn't take long. One overly eager jogger, headphones in, oblivious to the world, ran straight into the electric fence. There was a loud crackle, a yelp, and then a very ungraceful stumble backward. A few feet away, a group of kids playing soccer kicked their ball right into the fence, and when one of them tried to retrieve it, he got a nice little zap that sent him yelping back to his parents. Screams, confusion, chaos, it was glorious. Margaret was the first to recover. She stormed through the crowd, red-faced and livid. "This is illegal," she shrieked. "No, it's not," I called back. I checked. Perfectly within county regulations. Non-lethal, too. Wouldn't want anyone getting seriously hurt. Just a friendly reminder to stay off private property. "You're a menace," she spat. "No, I'm a landowner," I corrected. "Something you seem to have trouble understanding." Margaret's face twisted into something truly ugly. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming off. The next day, I received an official cease and desist letter from the HOA, demanding that I take down the electric fences and remove all deterrents. I forwarded the letter to Curtis, who practically cackled when he read it. "They really think they can bully you into giving up?" he said. "Oh, this is getting fun." He drafted a counter-demand, stating that if the HOA continued to claim my land as community property, then they were financially responsible for its upkeep. That meant paying for fencing, security, liability insurance, and, of course, back taxes. By the time the numbers were crunched, the HOA owed me so much money they'd have to start charging every homeowner triple just to cover the costs. Margaret's response came in the form of a desperate emergency meeting with the HOA board. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. Word spread fast. Homeowners were furious when they found out that their fees were about to skyrocket, all because Margaret had overstepped her authority. People who had once sung her praises were now calling for her resignation. 2 days later, I found Margaret at my gate again, looking far less confident than before. She cleared her throat, gripping her clipboard like a lifeline. "Mr. Monroe," she started, her voice strained. "The board has reconsidered its stance. We are willing to discuss a peaceful resolution." I grinned. I'm listening. She swallowed hard. If you agree to remove the fences, we'll drop all HOA claims on your land. I took a long, dramatic sip of my coffee. Tempting. But here's the thing, Margaret. I like my fences, and I really like watching you squirm. Her face tightened. This is extortion. No, this is justice, I said. You tried to steal my land. You lost. And now, you're going to do exactly what I say. Margaret stared at me for a long moment, jaw clenched, before finally nodding. Fine. The board will vote to officially remove your land from the HOA. That's a good start, I said. And one more thing. You're gonna cover my legal fees. Her nostrils flared. You can't be serious. I crossed my arms. Oh, I'm dead serious. Silence stretched between us. Then, with visible effort, she gave a stiff nod. Fine. I smiled, watching as she turned on her heel and walked away. The war wasn't over yet, but I had won the battle. And I wasn't done making them pay. Margaret's defeat should have been the end of it, but I knew better. People like her didn't just roll over and accept failure. They plotted, schemed, and looked for any possible loophole to claw their way back to power. So I stayed ready. I reinforced my fences, added even more security cameras, and made sure my lawyer was on standby for whatever nonsense they tried next. But to my surprise, things stayed quiet. Too quiet. Then, about a week later, I started noticing strange things. A group of men in suits, none of whom I recognized, were seen walking around the neighborhood, speaking in hushed voices with various HOA board members. A few residents stopped waving at me in town, looking guilty whenever I caught their eyes. It didn't take long for word to spread that the HOA was in full-blown crisis mode. Homeowners were furious about the special assessment fees Margaret had tried to impose, and a petition had started circulating demanding her resignation. It all came to a head at the next HOA meeting. Now, I normally wouldn't have bothered attending one of their little neighborhood cult gatherings, but this time was different. This time, they were discussing whether or not Margaret should remain in charge. And I wouldn't miss that for the world. I arrived early, taking a seat near the back, arms crossed as I watched the chaos unfold. The moment Margaret walked in, the tension in the room thickened. She took her usual seat at the front, but for the first time, there was no smugness in her expression. No air of superiority. Just tightly controlled panic. An elderly man, Mr. Wilkes, stood up first. He'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and had once been one of Margaret's biggest supporters. But tonight, he looked furious. "We've had enough," he announced, voice shaking with anger. "Margaret, under your leadership, this HOA has gone from a simple community association to some kind of dictatorship. You overstepped your bounds, cost us thousands of dollars, and nearly got us sued into the ground." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Margaret opened her mouth to defend herself, but another homeowner cut her off. "You told us Monroe's land was legally ours," a woman snapped. "You lied. And because of you, my family has to pay an extra $5,000 in HOA fees this year. Are you going to reimburse me, Margaret?" Margaret's face went red. "I was acting in the best interests of the community." "No," I called out from the back, leaning forward with a grin. "You were acting in the best interests of yourself." Heads turned toward me. I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch before I spoke again. "Margaret tried to steal my land," I said, loud and clear. "She thought she could bully me into handing it over, and when that didn't work, she tried to bury me in paperwork. But she failed. And now, she's scrambling to clean up the mess she made." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't even belong to this HOA, Monroe." "Oh, but I do," I said with a smirk. "Remember? You forced my property into your jurisdiction. Which means I get a vote." A ripple of shock spread through the room. The board members whispered among themselves, realizing the full scope of what I had just said. Margaret had been so determined to claim my land that she had unknowingly given me the power to vote on her removal. Someone motioned for the vote to begin. It wasn't even close. One by one, hands shot up in favor of removing Margaret from the HOA presidency. The final count was overwhelmingly against her. Margaret slumped in her seat, looking as if someone had just pulled the rug out from under her entire existence. The next day, I was back on my ranch, enjoying the peace and quiet, when a moving truck pulled up to Margaret's house. I stepped onto my porch and watched with mild amusement as she stomped back and forth, barking orders at the movers. She had lost everything: her power, her influence, her standing in the neighborhood, and now she was leaving. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That evening, I got a knock on my door. A group of HOA board members stood there, looking unusually nervous. One of them, a younger guy named Derek, cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, we've been talking," he said. "And since Margaret's gone, we need a new president." I narrowed my eyes. "Let me stop you right there. If you're about to ask what I think you're about to ask, the answer is hell no." Derek raised his hands. "Hear us out. We know the HOA has been a disaster lately. We need someone strong, someone who won't let power go to their head." I crossed my arms. "Not interested." Another board member, a woman in her 50s, stepped forward. "Jack, if you become president, you could dissolve the HOA." That made me pause. "Say that again." "If you take over, you could vote to dismantle it entirely," she said. "No more fees, no more ridiculous rules. Just homeowners managing their own property, like it should have been from the start." I took a long moment to think it over. The idea of running an HOA made me want to gag, but the idea of permanently putting an end to their nonsense? That had potential. I exhaled sharply. "Fine. I'll do it. But only on one condition." Derek nodded eagerly. "Anything. I don't want to hear a single complaint when I burn every one of your HOA rulebooks." A week later, it was official. The HOA was dissolved by unanimous vote. Homeowners were free to do whatever they pleased with their own property. No more fines for grass that was an inch too tall. No more ridiculous restrictions on paint colors. No more tyrannical power trip. And just like that, peace returned to the neighborhood. To celebrate, I threw the biggest barbecue the neighborhood had ever seen. The smell of smoked brisket filled the air, beer flowed freely, and for the first time in years, people actually looked happy to be living here. As I stood by the grill, watching my neighbors laughing and enjoying themselves, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Satisfaction. Curtis showed up halfway through the party, shaking his head in amusement. "You really did it," he said, grabbing a plate of ribs. "You destroyed an HOA." I smirked. "Told you I'd fight dirty." He laughed. "What are you gonna do with all your free time now?" I glanced toward the horizon, where my newly reinforced fences stood tall and unchallenged. "Oh, I'll think of something." And with that, I raised my beer, taking a long, slow sip as the sun dipped below the horizon. My land was mine again. No one would ever take it from me. Not an HOA, not a bureaucrat, not a single soul. I had won.